Tom Woods Show, episode 1665.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Folks, by now you've probably noticed that news about the virus is almost always fact-free hysteria these days. So you need my brand new free ebook, Your Facebook Friends Are Wrong About the Lockdown. Go pick it up at wrongaboutlockdown.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here, delighted to be joined by Dan McCarthy today. Dan is editor of Modern Age, which you can visit over at modernagejournal.com, and he's been doing some writing recently that I think is of potential interest to listeners. Dan's a conservative. He's a conservative of the traditional sort, the anti-Iraq war kind of conservative, so he's my kind of guy. You're not going to agree with everything he says, but you know, I get told all the time, why don't you have people other than libertarians on the show? Then I do that, and people get all up in arms. Wait a minute, that guy wasn't a libertarian. Come on, for heaven's sake. Dan's a friend, and we're all going to live if we hear somebody we don't agree with. We are. I guarantee you're still going to be alive the other end of this show. All right, anyway, but Dan's smart. I value his opinion, and I want to bounce some things off him. So I'm delighted to welcome him back. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Tom.
I've been reading your columns recently. I'm going to link to a couple of them at tomwoods.com/1665. The one on Nike, and then the one kind of looking more or less at the likely political fallout of the rioting. Now, I talked yesterday with Eric July about the whole thing. We talked George Floyd, we talked about police brutality, we talked about possible solutions to that, and then we talked about rioting and looting and people who implicitly or explicitly make excuses for rioting. Yes, rioting is wrong, but it's always but. There's always a but in there. And I'd even got to the point, maybe you being more of a stickler than I will have an objection to this, but I even said in my email newsletter, there is an easy way. Now, this is adapted from a Michael Malice saying, but it's different. I said, there's one question that you have to ask if you want to see if somebody is on the left or the right. And you simply ask, are rioting and looting wrong? And if you're on the right, you'll say yes. And if you're on the left, you'll give a speech. Works every time. Has never failed me. So, but my point is that we talked about the details and the nitty-gritty. Here I want to step back a bit and analyze what the likely political fallout of this is. Obviously, Donald Trump is taking pretty dramatic steps, and there are a lot of people who are unhappy about those steps, and they think it's going to hurt him, or they hope it's going to hurt him. But what I think they don't get, just from a political standpoint, is that the polling numbers don't look good for let's say, the riot sympathizers. Overwhelmingly, people want some kind of military solution, whether it is outright the U.S. military or the National Guard or something, but they are calling for something drastic to be done. They're really, it's a tough sell to say to America, let's have the cities burned down and sit back and more or less do nothing.
Well, that's right. But there is this paradox where the idea of stern measures against the rioting are very popular in the polls. But Donald Trump himself is still lagging. And it seems as if, even when you poll Donald Trump supporters, you'll find that a lot of them are very unhappy with his response to the riots. And I can see why, because on the one hand, the press is as hysterical as always and is claiming that Donald Trump is, acting with, sort of authoritarian rigor against the protests and the rioters, the looters and the arsonists. And in fact, he hasn't really done all that much so far. He had a short excursion out of the White House, yesterday. This is would have been on Monday, where he just goes down to a church that had a fire in its basement, and he poses for a picture there. And Trump has said he's going to declare Antifa to be a domestic terrorist group. But we don't really actually see mass arrests or anything that's stopping these riots from taking place in cities across the country. So I think people want to see something done, and they're not really sure if Donald Trump is doing it.
Well, it just seems to me the opportunity to give unimpeachable, well, if I may use that word, speech to the country is right before him. I mean, to give a really solemn address, and with the presumption that the networks will carry it, but in which you really do reach out to the average American and you say, now look, I bet there are a lot of you who haven't agreed with a lot of the things that I've done so far, but surely we can agree that this has to stop. and that what we've had so far are by and large feckless Democratic governors. For example, Andrew Cuomo had a tweet the other day, Dan, where at the end he said, "This will not be tolerated." And so I retweeted that and I said, I'd hate to see what this would be tolerated would look like. If what we're seeing is them not, this is their zero tolerance for rioting policy, pretty terrible. But you could give a talk like this in which you say, look, we can all understand why people felt the need to protest. And at the same time, virtually everybody can equally understand that we cannot allow this to go on. And so I'm going to take the following measures, and I'm calling upon the governors to take the following measures and let the record show that I'm calling for this and the governors are doing that. And we'll see which one winds up looking better in the eyes of history. I mean, you could give a speech like this, and you could have it be a beautiful, rhetorically elevated speech where at the end you'd have to say, yeah, I really kind of hate this guy's guts. But on the other hand, obviously, how many more days of burning our cities can we handle? I mean, at some point, even chic lefty people have to grow weary of it at some point.
Oh, I don't know about that. I think the chic lefty
okay,
people
all right, that was
are,
wishful thinking.
No, this is as I said in one of my columns, this is a celebration. It's not a revolution. These are conquerors who are enjoying the fruits of their victory. And their victory was won, sometime maybe 20 years ago. I can't tell you exactly when. But it was a moral revolution which said that, the rule of law is bad. Police officers are bad. Law enforcement is bad. And, anyone who wants to go out on the street instead of, casting a vote in an election or, sort of writing or doing something rational to protest a policy they don't like. No, you just go out in the street, you wave a sign, you shout. And then, sooner or later you get the arsonists and the looters come along and you kind of excuse them because, hey, their hearts are in the right place, even if they're going a little too far. And this mentality, this acceptance of lawlessness has crept into certainly it's in the Republican Party. It even seems to be in much of the Donald Trump re-election campaign. I heard that the Trump campaign sent out an email saying, in the midst of this rioting, hey, you know what? Joe Biden is really bad because he voted for the 1994 crime bill. He co-authored it. I mean, my God. I mean, it's as if, you've got subversives trying to elect Joe Biden in the Trump campaign. Now, there's plenty of things you can pick, nits at with the 94 crime bill, but this is not exactly the moment to be saying that, hey, my opponent is too tough on crime and not nearly sensitive enough to, the concerns of rioters. It's insane.
That is quite surprising. Now, let me raise a couple of concerns people have had. Now, I know some people are just going to go berserk about what you said about law enforcement, but you're talking about moral principles, and there's no question about it. I mean, you don't have to look very deeply to look in, for example, the 60s subculture to see that it didn't matter if the police were all like Andy Griffith. That didn't matter. It didn't matter if they were good or bad. It was they represent authority. That's the issue. I have plenty of problems with the way police departments often conduct themselves. The incentives under which they operate are, as with any division of government power, not ideal, to put it mildly. But what I want to focus on are a couple of items from just recent days. Now, you mentioned the president making that walk from the White House to St. John's, the church. And there are people who say now that, or you read in the paper that they say that they tear gassed peacefully assembled people in order to make way for Trump to make that triumphant walk. And that is surely now. Then other people say it was not tear gas; it was a smoke that doesn't actually hurt you. I don't know. I wasn't there. How am I going to know which one of those is correct? But what about that story?
Well, you're right. The National Park Service has said that no, that was not tear gas that was used, and this seemed like to me the right thing for Donald Trump to do. I think it was actually good that he and the Secret Service and the police showed that they are not intimidated. They're willing to come out of the White House, walk, a block away to St. John's, a church that had just been vandalized and burned, and to say, hey, you've still got some sort of rule of law in this country. You've still got some sort of freedom for people to go from point A to point B without being molested by rioters and having, broken glass thrown at them or something like that. So, as a visual, I think that was perfectly fine. And, this whole idea that, there is this bright line between the protesters and the rioters is unfortunately just not true. I mean, the rioters are a byproduct of the protests. And you've got a right to protest. You can go out, in a public space and do your thing. But again, the whole notion that protests are the best thing you could possibly do, and that the protests are somehow saving lives and are, this wonderful act of resistance. No, it's not. What it's doing is simply going out there and saying, you know what, I have contempt for the rule of law. I don't believe that a jury is going to do justice. I think that, law enforcement is totally corrupt. I think we don't need to have an election. We just need to come out here and pretend like we're the French Revolution and pretend like we're going to, sort of shout at people until, people start collapsing and doing as we tell them. And then, oh boy, we're surprised that we suddenly have lawlessness. We suddenly have looters getting in on the act. We have sort of a left-wing Antifa going around with tools and smashing up streets, picking up bricks and throwing them through windows. Gosh, who could have predicted, right? Who could have predicted that when you abandon, civil discourse and the rule of law, you actually get people turning into not just protesters, but actual rioters?
Well, I'll get in trouble for this, but for heaven's sake, we got to just talk here. I mean, it's. I know that I'll have a sliver of my listeners who will be disappointed in me, but, well, that's okay. I mean, you guys are all good people anyway. But I know I've got at least a core of people who just in their gut, they know something's not quite right here. They know something is wrong. They know it's weird that most libertarians seem to be taking the position of, yeah, I hear you. Of course it's bad to burn down cities, but. And I mean, what good are we with all our talk about property rights? What good are we if we can't at least say, don't burn down your whole, your civilization, please? Like, we can't say, we have to have an asterisk next to that when this is going on. So I feel like if I were running a series of protests against the Federal Reserve, and Dan, I feel strongly about the Federal Reserve. And I'll admit that's a nerdy topic. It's not for everyone. But intellectually, it gives me pleasure to dismantle the Fed. And I've done this in books and articles, and I just enjoy doing it. If I had a series of protests on this topic, and almost all of them, or a substantial number of them, somehow got infiltrated or degenerated into violence that undermined my alleged message, I would stop holding them. And I would say, I obviously have to, for purely strategic reasons. Yes, of course, in the abstract, I have the right to do it. How dopey it would have to be to make that objection. Of course, I get that. I'm talking from a purely strategic and common sense standpoint. Wouldn't I say to myself, maybe I'm better off trying to spread this message another way, lest I wind up being confused with violent rioters? Now, that's an obvious point, and yet by saying it, I'm probably losing 20% of my listeners. Like, what the hell is going on here?
Well, and of course, if you staged a protest against the Federal Reserve and there were one, sort of lone nut who goes and does something, awful.
We'd never hear the end of it for the next 100 years.
Well, that's right. All the media would swarm upon you. They would, call you a lot of names. They would say, well, look, this all along, this was a neo-fascist project. This was, never
right.
about, so I mean, you would not even get the benefit of the doubt. I mean, it would be open and shut, and you'd be, you'd be under investigation, if not by the FBI, then by the SPLC. I mean, your life would be ruined. Whereas what you're saying now, I mean, you actually do have these Antifa elements who are organized, and they carry bricks around, they carry hammers around, and everybody knows this. The media is simply backing this up. They know there's going to be violence. They know this is a certainty. And all they're doing is saying, you know what, this is great, this needs to go on. And if anyone, the police or shopkeepers or anyone else, dares to defy the mob and dares to actually try to say, wait a minute, you people are, sort of, you protesters, you rioters. I shouldn't say you people, because you may recall that Ross Perot got in trouble for that, where people was suddenly turned into
right.
some sort of racial epithet. No, I'm talking about leftists. I'm not talking about people. Leftists, have the media behind them. They can get away with violence. They can't perhaps quite get away with murder, but they can get away with just about anything short of that. And what's really telling is, one of these columns I wrote talks about how I don't think corporate America really cares about any of this. In fact, they see it as a great marketing opportunity. Nike has been, trying to sell itself as a countercultural brand, a revolutionary, stick it to the man brand. So if their stores, with their, sneakers that are cheaply produced get vandalized and get looted, that's fine. It's showing that the really cool people out there, the cool, edgy looters, actually want to have Nike products, and that means everyone should go out and buy Nike products. But the small shopkeeper they're the ones who are getting knocked over here. And a lot of them are the people that the left claims to care about. They're immigrants, they're minority business owners. They are losing their livelihoods. And, not only does the left not care, but I really don't see a hell of a lot of sympathy from most libertarians either. They seem to be looking at this as like, well, who cares? You still have Amazon. You can still get any consumer good you want. Who needs, the mom and pop store? Okay, so the guy invested a lot of his money in it, but that's just kind of the hazard. And it's really much more important to talk about how bad the police are and how bad the rioters are and how they've destroyed your livelihood and your business.
The other part of this, you hit on it with the corporate stuff. It's like, I don't know if maybe the Borg is the right image for this. Whenever there is something like this, and I hope nothing I'm involved in, well, look, nothing I'm involved in is ever fashionable, so I don't have any risk of that happening, but my inbox is overflowing with emails from CEOs I couldn't care less about. I don't care who runs Etsy. I really don't, and I don't care what that person's opinion of pretty much anything is. But I found out about it today, and you'll never guess, Dan, it was entirely predictable. It was by the script. It was the same script I got from the president of Harvard, because I'm on their list, from the president of Columbia, I'm on their list. Not a word, not one, not even really anything about people who are watching Midtown Manhattan be destroyed, with the police standing down because I guess they've been told they have to. They're watching this happen in front of their eyes, and we're getting letters telling us, what? You can tell the 5 predictable bullet points. And it's not to say there's absolutely no merit in it, but it's this Borg mentality. It's like when LGBT Pride Month, this month, comes along. It doesn't even matter what your opinion on that is. What's bizarre about it is everybody feels compelled to say the same things, almost in the same phraseology. I can't quite put my finger on what's so creepy about it, but everybody suddenly talks the same way, thinks the same way, has the same priorities, won't admit that there are any contrary views whatsoever. Anybody with a contrary view is obviously a reprehensible human being, not even to be acknowledged, much less refuted. You know what I'm talking about? The Borg writing to you all day long?
No, I've had the same feeling. And if you look at what journalists and pundits are saying on Twitter, it's like they're all reading off of the same script. Every single one of them will focus on, here's a member of the press who got, hit by a rubber bullet. Here's Donald Trump. This is, what we're claiming is tear gas. Okay, fine. You need to get that information out there. That's perfectly reasonable. But it's all focusing on that or overwhelmingly focusing on those points. And then the pundits have very little to say about, what, maybe this, the fact that you have off-duty police officers being, murdered in cold blood in St. Louis and Las Vegas and other places, maybe that's something that we should kind of stop and think about before we continue to, incite more of this protesting and rioting and it's just stupid rebellion. One of the things that really disgusts me about this whole thing is you have people going out there claiming that they are, taking some sort of moral risk by going out there or risking their lives by going out there. And just as you've said, in fact, what it is an exercise in conformity. It's an exercise in everyone saying, you know what, I have no opinions of my own. I am not interested in facts that might disturb the preconceived narrative that has been implanted in my brain. I am actually just as conformist as you are, if not more so. Let's all go out there and say how much we hate law and order together. You can see what's paradoxical about that. On the one hand, it's against any kind of legal or structural authority. But on the other hand, it also is 100% conformist. It really is extremely creepy. It's like, what is it, Village of the Damned, where all the children have been replaced by robots or something, or Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where everyone's been replaced by a pod person. It really is this sense of, hey, one of the weaknesses I think libertarians have in trying to deal with this is they can only look at formal structures. They look at the police officers, they say, okay, police officers, they formally have the power to come in and to, arrest you and to use physical force against you. Therefore, they're bad. They look at the White House. They look at, the president. They say, okay, this is a branch of government. It's therefore bad because it's coercive. They don't think very much about how behind these, sort of coercive institutions, you actually have a deeper power structure. Just as you have the deep state in government, you actually have something equivalent to that within society. And it is precisely this Borg mentality, which is able not only to use commercial power, it's able to do a lot of things to you that the government can't do. it's also able to employ government power. It's also able to put someone like, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris into the White House and to have them run roughshod and confiscate your guns. I mean, that's where things get really crazy, right? It's one thing to say, hey, I'm a libertarian. I really don't want to have a police force, but hey, I do believe in the Second Amendment. Let's all get guns and let's protect our own shops. There are some downsides to that, but at least there's, some sort of willingness to stand up for an order of some kind and property rights of some kind. But of course, if libertarians are going to stand by and see Joe Biden elected, then what's going to happen? Well, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to work to take away all those firearms. So the police aren't going to enforce the law, and you're not going to be able to enforce your own property rights. You're simply going to be out there easy pickings for the looters.
Meanwhile, I guess it was 2-3 days ago, a colleague of mine said something like this. Whenever somebody comes along and says, we need to have a conversation about X, what they really mean is, I'm about to engage in a haranguing monologue about X. It never means we're actually going to have a conversation. And so then these very people will say, we need to have a conversation about race, or so, whatever it is. Maybe race is the one they always say they want to have a conversation about. But it's never a conversation. It's always hectoring. And no matter what you say, you're a racist or a white supremacist. So if you say, but race doesn't matter to me, or I don't see race or whatever, they say that's white supremacist. And if you say, look, I try to be kind to everybody in my daily life, that's white supremacist because you're not focusing on the structural problems. I mean, almost no matter what you do, you're not just misguided or uninformed. You are assumed to be the worst possible kind of person there is, because the worst kind they can think of is a white supremacist. It boggles my mind. So we can't talk about anything because as soon as you open your mouth, you're branded something. Everybody's a racist no matter what you do. If you do X, if you do not X, you're a racist either way. So, all right. Let me get on to what we were supposed to talk about from the beginning, which is, what does this mean electorally now? I mean, there's a part of me that thinks, kind of the way you do, that maybe in a way we're back to Richard Nixon again and the great silent majority, except there's much less moral cohesion in the country than there was in the late 60s, early 70s. That's one thing. Secondly, the police are definitely not held in as high regard as they used to be. That's number two. But at the same time, it does seem like when you look at the poll numbers, I just saw a poll saying, should the U.S. military be called in to suppress the rioting? 58 to 30% yes. Same poll, should the National Guard be called out? 71% yes. Overwhelming. I mean, that's a pretty decisive series of numbers. So you would think all Trump has to do is contrast his walk to that church. I'm just thinking of the visuals here. His walk to that church with these governors impotently giving meaningless, mealy-mouthed speeches with images of burning buildings and people climbing on cars in the background. I mean, the ads write themselves in a way. Am I wrong?
No, you're quite right. But it's going to take an administration and also a Trump campaign that really want to win and really want to win the way Trump won in 2016. And unfortunately, if you have a lot of squishy Republicans in both of those institutions, they're going to confuse the messaging, dilute it, and prevent it from being effective. The lesson of 1968, on the one hand, is Richard Nixon, but it's also, on the other hand, Lyndon Johnson. I mean, Lyndon Johnson was a guy who, escalated the Vietnam War, and he got himself into a mess that he couldn't get the country out of. And, you had riots taking place under Johnson's administration. Johnson, he was a civil rights president. He passed plenty of signed plenty of legislation. He was not necessarily, the guy you would have expected to be kowtowing to the mob, but he mismanaged all of this. He couldn't, seem to have lost control of the country. And so he didn't even bother running for re-election because he knew it was hopeless. I mean, his own party was divided and he couldn't have won in November, or at least he assumed he couldn't. So Donald Trump, not in quite exactly the same position as either Johnson or Nixon, but boy, I mean, he's got to take a very bold stand here. And, he has to do what you said earlier in the conversation where, he has to make a big speech. He has to, expand on the visuals, and he actually has to follow through with policy. I mean, he should be arresting these rioters and putting them in jail for 20-year sentences. The idea that, you're just going to, make some symbolic designations of some, semi-coherent organization as a domestic terrorist group, what does that actually accomplish, right? I mean, what you want to see is that the criminals, the looters, the arsonists, the murderers get put behind bars. Short of that, I think everything else is going to really leave the American people unsatisfied.
How about if you were Joe Biden right now? Are you concerned about what this means for you, or do you think chaos in some way has to work against the incumbent?
Yeah, it works against the incumbent. And, here too, Biden's in the same position as Trump in that he has a card which he can play either intelligently or stupidly. On the one hand, Joe Biden actually has a record of being fairly tough on crime. And this is something that, has actually disturbed some of the Democratic base. But if Joe Biden were willing to say to, the sort of Bernie Sanders left and the people who are far to the left of Bernie Sanders and simply say, you know what, I'm actually proud of my votes in the 1990s against, the rioters and the criminals, that would actually put Biden in a pretty strong position. And if he chooses someone like Kamala Harris as his running mate, there too you have, a decision that could work one of two ways. On the one hand, she could be seen as being sympathetic to the rioters and the protesters, but she could also be seen as being a prosecutor who might actually be just tough on the basic law and order questions. I mean, regardless of ideology, just someone who is going to at least put some people in prison. And I think the American people, if they sort of close their eyes and just say, okay, what is a law and order ticket? They might go for a Biden-Harris ticket or something similar to it. So Donald Trump really has to make a persuasive case that he's in charge, that he's actually, successfully fighting these insurrections, and that his record is more tough on crime than Joe Biden's is. And Biden, I think so far he's been keeping a low profile, but I think he's been willing just by default to kind of win from both directions, win from the, liberals who say, hey, if we elect Joe Biden, he'll, push through a lot of left-wing policies that we like. But also there are just a lot of, sort of especially older Americans who remember that Joe Biden in the 90s was, a relatively sane Democrat, who are saying, you know what, maybe we actually need the return of that because, these Republicans seem to be kind of confused about whether they are, tough on crime or whether they're so afraid of being called bad names by the press that they're just not willing to do anything.
I was about to say I've been surprised. I've not been surprised, but let's just say maybe I've been surprised at how many people I've seen saying things like, well, you had to know when we elected Donald Trump that something like this would happen. We're talking about cities, the overwhelming majority of which have been governed by Democrats for, as I put it on Twitter, something like 11 gazillion years. And some of these states have Democratic governors, legislatures, the courts are all Democrats. It's whatever, all down to the dog catcher and the school board. Everything is Democrat. Things like police, that's your bailiwick. I mean, that's up to the local authorities and the state authorities. It has nothing to do with the president. And yet, with a straight face, we're being told, well, this goes to show we need somebody else in the White House. Why does it never show that you need somebody else in the governor's mansion, ever?
No, you're right. Exactly right. And that was true with the whole COVID-19 thing as well, where everything was made a federal case. When, of course, health and safety are primarily state and local level concerns. And it's not as if, the National Centers for Disease Control have any kind of, magic formula to help people, escape from the ravages of COVID-19. It really does come down to the local policies and the state policies. And if governors and mayors are not going to take responsibility, then the country is going to be a shipwreck. And again, I mean, this is what's interesting to me about the whole protest phenomenon is that it's meaningless, right? In terms of what it actually achieves. Like, do you change a law directly by protesting? No, of course you don't. The whole claim is that, well, maybe you can change a law because lawmakers are going to get scared or they're going to be embarrassed or something. So the whole thing is meant to be a psychological operation, an attempt to just change the way people think and evaluate. And again, it's this tyranny of a certain kind of, it's not a tyranny of the majority over opinion. It's actually a tyranny of an organized minority over opinion, a tyranny of elite opinion over everyone else, over normal law-abiding people. And the organs of government are actually kind of useless and hopeless up against this kind of elite opinion that is working in a very, kind of lockstep way. Not because it's a conspiracy, but just because the fundamental values that all of the people who have the power to craft opinion in the media and in the educational establishment and even in corporate America, all the fundamental values that have been inculcated in these people are left-wing values. They're values which say rioting and arson and looting, oh, they're a little bit naughty, but you know what? What's really bad is if, Not if you have 300, deaths by gangland shootings in Chicago. No, what's really bad is if you have, one death of someone who has a heart attack in the middle of getting arrested. That's the thing that, justifies having, civil unrest and, quasi-revolutionary, or at least, play-revolutionary activity on the streets. This really is the end of, sort of self-government and its replacement by elite psychological manipulation.
Who's been good on this, do you think, in public life?
Well,
it's hard to come up with an answer, isn't it? Isn't that shocking?
Tucker Carlson on his show, does, put out, messages that you won't hear anywhere else. But no, I mean, this isn't just a Trump problem where he's not being assertive enough. This is, other Republicans have, fallen by the wayside as well. I mean, Trump, of course, you could say that what he's trying to do is to be restrained and to kind of show to not rush into, confrontations and so forth, and to basically show all the virtues that his opponents say that he doesn't have. But of course, he doesn't get any credit from his opponents for showing those virtues or for showing any restraint. So it's just kind of a total loss.
Well, this is a terrible way to end the episode. So, it's hard for me to find any reason for hope at this point, Dan.
Well, but you know what? So, let's say this, though. So you do have this Borg mentality. And the thing is, it may be a complete sort of Potemkin village, right, to change the metaphor. Real Americans, by which I mean people who actually have jobs and who, have some relationship to, buying and selling, producing things, people who go to church, people who, just want to obey the law. They don't like to see African Americans mistreated by either criminals or by, overzealous law enforcement or by anyone else. And they would really like to see the country, sort of come together and heal. But they're not, supporting protests that are inane and the riots that develop inevitably out of them. These people, maybe they are, if not a silent majority, still enough of a silent plurality that they're going to make their presence felt. And if not, then, we may be in for some rough times. But there's a pendulum here and that things will swing around. And the fact is, I just don't think you can run a country. You certainly can't run one that claims to be democratic or Republican or self-governing if you have this kind of elite opinion that can't actually stop crime from taking place on the street, but it can, virtually get people to commit harakiri if they express the wrong opinion about a police procedure that goes awry.
I pointed out on social media that just like that, all of a sudden, concern about whether democracy is thriving in Nowhereistan, somewhere 5,000 miles away, just dropped to 54,722 on most people's priority list. All of a sudden, it suddenly rings true that really you need to focus on your home first, don't you? The idea of the United States lecturing anybody at this point is now getting to the point of being utterly laughable.
Well, it certainly shows, right, that why would anyone imagine that we can bring law and order to Syria or to Afghanistan or to Iraq when we can't bring law and order, to Washington, D.C. within, 4 blocks of the White House? But I'm afraid that, the sort of optimistic, return to reality that might be expected here might be exactly wrong. Because the other thing here is that, well, okay, so you get a Biden administration or you get, some other, change. Maybe the Democrats take the Senate. They're going to pursue the same kind of, globalist and interventionist military policy that they've always wanted to pursue. Or, if somewhere down the line you get an anti-Trump Republican, Nikki Haley or someone becomes president, that person is going to pursue the neocon foreign policy agenda just as before. So the fact that, our authorities and our leaders and our elite can't actually provide basic law and order here at home somehow doesn't mean actually that they're going to not try to continue to rule the world. And in fact, that they never get held accountable for anything. And that the very few occasions when they are held accountable, like in the 2016 election, where the entire establishment was humiliated by Donald Trump's victory, the fact that all of that can be unwound by, a number of manipulated protests just goes to show that the elite is not just, sort of incompetent, but it's also irresponsible and doesn't have to pay the price for the terrible decisions it makes that destroy lives in this country and around the world.
All right, folks, I want you to check out modernagejournal.com, which is the website of Modern Age, of which Dan is the editor. Modern Age is a venerable journal indeed, going back all the way to the 1950s, that has published anyone and everyone who is anyone in the conservative and libertarian worlds, from Russell Kirk to Murray Rothbard and many in between. So modernagejournal.com will be linked at tomwoods.com/1665, along with a couple of Dan's columns. And Dan, as I've been saying to people, it's great to talk to you, but I'm sorry it had to be under these circumstances. Thank you.
Well, but it's important that we have these discussions because this is actual real resistance, right? It's thinking for yourself and going against the grain of the Borg. And you do a tremendous service with your podcast, Tom. And I'm really honored to be on the show every time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And that actually reminds me of one final thing that I've been writing a lot on Twitter lately, as you can tell. I was wondering out loud, imagine holding opinions that are shared by every major power center in society. The media agrees with you on everything. The CEOs at least claim to agree with you on everything. Entertainment agrees with you on everything. Academia agrees with you on everything. And you still feel like you're chic and cheeky. Well, you know what? Try being on the other side of that when you feel like all the media is against you, entertainment, all the way down, all those institutions hate your guts and can't stand the sight of you. Try that on for size. You want to be cheeky and different? Try that on for size. But I rather doubt there's a huge rush by influential people to go do that, but I can't imagine being anywhere else. I do not have any desire to appease the New York Times or anybody who is seeking the approval of the New York Times. And with that, Dan, I will let you go and thank you again.
Thanks for having me on, Tom.
All right, folks, that's our episode for today. Now, tomorrow we have a non-virus, non-riot topic. How about that? Matt Ridley, our old friend from the UK, is coming back to talk more about innovation, some really, really interesting stories of innovation, and questions like, how come we have no idea who invented the personal computer? All kinds of interesting stuff like that. And what are the institutional prerequisites and other prerequisites for innovation? How does it happen and why, and what are the circumstances? All kinds of interesting stuff to talk about with Matt Ridley. So make sure you subscribe to The Tom Woods Show on Apple Podcasts over at tomwoods.com/Apple, and I'll see you then.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.